Boeing's challenge was never just about building aircraft again. It was about rebuilding the kind of trust without which even great engineering starts to lose value. When we look at a commercial airliner, we see a marvel of modern physics. We see hundreds of tons of aluminum, titanium, and composite materials propelled by massive turbine engines, defying gravity to connect continents. But this physical object is merely an illusion of what the aerospace industry actually sells. Airlines do not buy airplanes. They buy schedule reliability, they buy fuel efficiency, and above all, they buy certainty. The passenger boarding a flight at dawn does not inspect the rivets, review the software architecture, or audit the assembly line. They step onto the aircraft because of an invisible, highly complex infrastructure that precedes the flight itself. That infrastructure is trust. For decades, Boeing was not just a manufacturer, it was the global custodian of that trust. The phrase, "If it ain't Boeing, I ain't going," was not just a clever marketing slogan. It was a cultural truth born from a mid-century engineering doctrine that prioritized robust, over-engineered safety above all other metrics. Boeing was a company run by engineers, for pilots. It was an institution where the final word on any design was not delivered by an accountant, but by a chief mechanic. Then came the crisis. The surface story is one of the most covered corporate disasters of the 21st century. Between 2018 and 2019, two 737 VAX aircraft crashed, resulting in devastating loss of life. The global fleet was grounded. Years later, just as the company seemed to be stabilizing, a mid-air door plug blowout on a 737 Phase 7 MAX 9 violently reopened the wounds, exposing deep systemic flaws in manufacturing and quality control. The media narrative was swift, ruthless, and largely accurate at the surface level. Boeing had chosen profit over safety. They had prioritized share buybacks over ground-up engineering. They had rushed a legacy airframe to market to compete with Airbus, patching hardware limitations with a hidden software system called MPA-CAX. But to view Boeing's fall purely as a story of corporate greed, a software glitch, or a single negligent factory flaw is to misunderstand the architecture of a titan. The failure was not merely mechanical, nor was it just a bad quarter on Wall Street. It was the slow, deliberate dismantling of an entire operating philosophy. To understand how Boeing broke, and more importantly, the painful mechanics of how it is currently trying to fix itself, we have to look past the assembly line. We have to look at the doctrine of the company itself. In 1997, Boeing merged with its struggling rival McDonnell Douglas. On paper, Boeing acquired McDonnell Douglas. In reality, the culture of McDonnell Douglas, a culture heavily focused on cost-cutting, financial engineering, and shareholder returns, acquired Boeing. The physical manifestation of this shift happened in 2001, when Boeing moved its corporate headquarters from Seattle to Chicago and later to Arlington, Virginia. This was not just a real estate decision, it was a strategic decoupling. For the first time in the company's history, the executives making the financial decisions were physically and psychologically separated from the engineers designing the airplanes. The prevailing management philosophy of the era dictated that a great executive did not need to understand the product, they only needed to understand the balance sheet. Engineering was no longer seen as the core engine of the company, it was seen as a cost center. The goal shifted from building the best possible aircraft to building an aircraft that was good enough, while maximizing supply chain efficiency and capital returns. This philosophy birthed a highly fragmented, outsourced manufacturing model. To build the 787 Dreamliner and later updates to the 737, Boeing increasingly became an assembler of parts built by a vast, decentralized web of suppliers. The financial logic was sound: offload the capital risk, reduce internal overhead, and increase profit margins. But in high-stakes manufacturing, when you outsource the physical labor, you also outsource the quality control. The tight feedback loop between the designer, the riveter, and the inspector was severed. Furthermore, this financialization infected the regulatory relationship. For years, the Federal Aviation Administration had utilized an Organization Designation Authorization, or ODA, program. Essentially, the FAA delegated certain safety certification tasks to Boeing's own employees. In a high-trust, engineering-first culture, this system is efficient, but in a finance-first culture, where schedule delays are financially penalized and employees are pressured to hit targets, self-certification becomes a catastrophic vulnerability. The friction of distance, both geographic and philosophical, began to erode the invisible asset that held the entire enterprise together. Trust is not a static object. It is a depreciating asset. It requires constant maintenance, constant investment, and a culture that demands bad news be escalated immediately. Under the finance-first doctrine, bad news was discouraged. Delays were unacceptable. The schedule became the master. When the structural integrity of the company's culture was finally tested, it did not bend. It shattered. The immediate aftermath was chaotic. Executives were ousted. Billions of dollars in market capitalization were wiped out. Congressional hearings dragged the company's internal communications into the light, revealing a culture of arrogance, pressure, and dangerous compromises. But a broken giant cannot simply apologize its way back to dominance. It cannot PR its way out of an engineering crisis. When your product operates at 35,000 feet, carrying hundreds of human lives at 600 miles per hour, marketing is entirely meaningless. Boeing was faced with a stark, undeniable reality. The financial engineering that had driven the company for 2 decades was dead. The only way forward was a painful, fundamental restructuring of how the company operated at a molecular level. They had to relearn how to build airplanes. But more importantly, they had to understand how to manufacture trust, not as an abstract concept, but as a hard operational metric. Rebuilding trust at an industrial scale is a brutal, unglamorous process. It cannot be achieved through a rebranding campaign or a slick corporate apology. When your core currency is absolute certainty, trust must be manufactured as rigorously as the airframes themselves. The first step in this reconstruction was an admission of a fundamental strategic error. For 20 years, Boeing's operating model was built on dispersion, spreading the supply chain across the globe to optimize costs and leverage specialized contractors. To win back trust, Boeing had to embrace reconsolidation. The most glaring symbol of this reversal was the fate of Spirit AeroSystems. In 2005, Boeing spun off its Wichita, Kansas manufacturing facility, creating Spirit as an independent, publicly traded supplier. At the time, it was hailed as a masterstroke of financial engineering, instantly improving Boeing's balance sheet and shifting capital risk off its ledgers. Spirit was tasked with building the fuselages for the 737, the physical backbone of Boeing's most profitable aircraft. But spinning off the fuselage meant spinning off the core of the airplane's structural integrity. When the door plug blew out over Portland, the ensuing investigation pointed directly back to the fractured relationship, misaligned incentives, and communication breakdowns between Boeing and Spirit. Boeing's response was unprecedented for a modern, financially driven corporation. They announced they would buy Spirit AeroSystems back, absorbing billions of dollars in costs, liabilities, and debt. This was not an expansion strategy, it was a containment strategy. Boeing recognized a harsh truth: you cannot guarantee the quality of a complex system if you do not possess absolute authority over its components. To rebuild trust with the airlines and the regulators, Boeing had to buy back its own factory. They had to internalize the risk they had spent 2 decades trying to outsource. The financial logic of 2005 had entirely failed the engineering reality of the present. Simultaneously, the company's relationship with its primary regulator underwent a forced, agonizing reset. The FAA, heavily criticized by lawmakers and the public for its own lapses in oversight, stripped Boeing of its autonomy. They placed a hard, unforgiving cap on 737 VAX production. They embedded federal inspectors directly onto the factory floor. The era of delegated self-certification was functionally over. For a company geared toward high-volume, lean output, the production cap was financially devastating. It meant burning through cash reserves while their primary rival Airbus captured more market share and secured massive long-term orders. But strategically, it was the exact constraint Boeing required. It forced the company to stop optimizing for velocity and start optimizing for precision. Inside the sprawling factories in Renton and Everett, a hidden operational cancer had to be eradicated, the phenomenon known as traveled work. Under the old financial doctrine, if a part was missing from a supplier or a specific task was incomplete, the aircraft would still move down the assembly line to keep the master schedule intact. The missing work would be completed later, out of sequence, often resulting in complex fixes, rushed inspections, and mechanics working in tight, finished spaces where they shouldn't be. This created a shadow factory, a secondary, inefficient process running parallel to the main line, serving as a massive breeding ground for defects. To rebuild the invisible asset of trust, Boeing had to halt the line. They instituted a new, rigid doctrine: no traveled work. If a defect is found or a part is missing, the assembly stops. The problem is fixed in position. This caused massive compounding delays. It infuriated Wall Street analysts who only saw missed quarterly delivery targets. But to the aerospace engineers, and more importantly, to the airlines waiting for those planes, it was the first tangible signal that the deep structural rot was finally being addressed. Boeing was finally willing to take a financial hit to protect the integrity of the aircraft. However, fixing the physical assembly line is only half the equation. The other half is fixing the human culture that operates it. A factory is ultimately a reflection of its leadership. For a quarter of a century, Boeing's leadership had been dominated by executives who viewed the company as a financial portfolio to be managed, rather than an engineering firm to be led. To arrest the decline, the board of directors and the wider aerospace community finally understood that they needed a complete philosophical transplant at the top. The departure of the executives who oversaw the crisis era paved the way for a necessary return to the company's roots. They realized they needed leadership that understood aerodynamics and structural stress, as well as they understood profit margins. They needed executives who belonged on the factory floor, who understood the tension of a torque wrench, the complexities of software integration, and the reality of supply chain bottlenecks. The physical and psychological distance between the C-suite and the assembly line had to be closed. This cultural shift required rewriting the internal incentive structures. For years, middle managers were heavily rewarded for hitting schedule milestones and implicitly penalized for raising issues that caused delays. To rebuild safety, Boeing had to completely invert this model. They had to weaponize the stop work authority. In a healthy aerospace culture, any mechanic at any time must have the psychological safety and the operational mandate to pull the cord and stop production without fear of retaliation or reprimand. Boeing had to prove to its own workforce that safety was no longer a corporate compliance checklist, but the ultimate operational priority. They had to restructure reporting lines so that safety inspectors reported directly to the highest levels of the company, completely bypassing the managers whose bonuses depended on production speed. But changing internal flowcharts is merely the beginning. The most brutal audits of Boeing's reformed culture are not coming from the FAA or the internal quality assurance teams. They are coming from the ultimate arbiters of the aerospace market, the airlines themselves. For decades, the power dynamic in aviation was fiercely asymmetrical. Boeing and Airbus held an impenetrable duopoly, dictating terms, timelines, and technology to the market. Airlines were essentially forced to accept what was built on the schedule it was delivered, but the breakdown of Boeing's reliability flipped this dynamic entirely. Major carriers from United Airlines to Ryanair to Emirates suddenly found their entire global growth strategies paralyzed by Boeing's inability to deliver safe certified aircraft on time. Airlines operate on hyper-thin margins where fleet predictability is the only defense against market volatility. When Boeing failed to deliver, airlines had to abruptly cancel routes, freeze pilot hiring, retain older, less fuel-efficient aircraft, and hemorrhage revenue. This created a profound structural shift. Airline CEOs stopped treating Boeing as a revered, unquestionable partner and began treating them as a highly unreliable supplier who required aggressive supervision. Carriers began deploying their own senior mechanics and inspectors to Boeing's facilities in Seattle and Charleston. They demanded unprecedented access to the factory floor, refusing to accept multi-million-dollar deliveries until their own engineers had independently verified the manufacturing quality. This was a deeply humbling but necessary paradigm shift for the aerospace giant. Boeing had to learn to operate under a harsh external microscope, surrendering the institutional arrogance of its past. The company had to transition from a philosophy of "trust us, we are Boeing" to a doctrine of "verify everything, we have nothing to hide." Recently, this massive cultural pivot culminated in the appointment of a new CEO. After years of being led by executives with backgrounds in accounting, private equity, and corporate management, the board finally appointed a career aerospace engineer to take the helm. This was not a routine leadership transition. It was a profound strategic signal to the regulators, the airlines, and the beleaguered workforce. It signaled the absolute death of the spreadsheet manager dictating terms to the factory. It was a formal acknowledgement that the engineers had to take the company back. This shift reveals a deeper, universal truth about the nature of trust in high-stakes industries. We often mistake trust for a feeling, a subjective emotional bond. a brand halo, or a clever public relations narrative. In the realm of consumer software or fast fashion, perhaps that definition holds. But in industrial engineering, where the laws of physics do not negotiate and structural failure means catastrophic loss of life, trust is not an emotion. Trust is a hard, measurable, verifiable system. It is the aggregate result of 1,000 small, invisible processes operating exactly as designed every single time. It is the torque wrench calibrated to the micromillimeter on a Tuesday morning. It is the software architecture reviewed by 3 independent adversarial teams. It is the junior mechanic who feels entirely empowered to halt a billion-dollar assembly line because a single rivet looks anomalous, knowing the company will reward them rather than fire them. When a company financializes its operations, it aggressively abstracts away these physical realities. It looks at the quarterly spreadsheet and sees immediate, localized deficiencies, completely blind to the fact that it is silently depleting its massive reserves of systemic trust. The doctrine of shareholder primacy, which dominated corporate America for decades, convinced generations of executives that the ultimate purpose of a company was simply to generate immediate cash returns. But Boeing's collapse stands as the ultimate empirical disproof of that doctrine. It proves that financialization, when divorced from product excellence, is a parasite that eventually kills the host. If an engineering company optimizes exclusively for the stock price, it will eventually destroy both the engineering and the stock price. The clean, predictable abstraction of the spreadsheet can never survive a collision with the chaotic, unforgiving reality of the physical world. In the modern tech economy, we have been deeply conditioned by the ethos of Silicon Valley. Software companies are praised for shipping minimum viable products, testing them in the wild, and patching the inevitable bugs later through over-the-air updates. The cost of failure is a crashed app, a frustrated user, or a temporary server outage. But you cannot apply a software doctrine to a hardware reality. You cannot beta test a commercial airliner. In aerospace, a bug is not an inconvenience. It is a fatality. When Boeing's previous management tried to apply lean, agile, software-like financial metrics to heavy industrial manufacturing, they fundamentally misunderstood the underlying physics and stakes of their own industry. Boeing is now engaged in one of the most difficult, expensive corporate maneuvers in modern industrial history, trying to unengineer 2 decades of MBA-driven culture to resurrect a fortress of engineering excellence. The path forward is agonizingly slow. The company is burning billions of dollars in free cash flow to stabilize its supply chain and absorb its former contractors. Production rates remain intentionally sluggish as the shadow factories are dismantled and rigorous new inspection protocols are enforced. They are losing significant ground to Airbus in crucial high-margin market segments. Yet, despite the immense damage, Boeing's survival is practically a geopolitical and macroeconomic imperative. The global aviation ecosystem and the American industrial base cannot function with a single monopoly supplier based in Europe. Airbus simply cannot build enough aircraft to sustain the projected growth of global air travel over the next 2 decades. The system requires 2 healthy titans to maintain balance, drive innovation, and keep costs competitive. Furthermore, Boeing represents over 1% of the entire United States gross domestic product. It is the nation's largest manufacturing exporter. Its sprawling supply chain supports thousands of small and medium-sized enterprises across all 50 states. The Defense Department relies on its deep engineering capabilities for national security. A broken Boeing creates a massive vacuum in global trade and geopolitical power. Because of this, Boeing will not disappear. The question is not whether the company will survive, but what kind of company it will be on the other side of this grueling reconstruction. Will it remain a permanently wounded giant, forever constrained by regulatory mistrust and customer skepticism? Or will it emerge as an organization that has fundamentally relearned the brutal cost of its own arrogance? The turnaround of Boeing is a crucible that offers the most profound strategic lesson of the century for any leader, founder, or architect of complex systems. We live in an era obsessed with velocity, disruptive innovation, and infinite scale. Leaders are constantly pressured to move fast, to break down traditional barriers, and to optimize their operations for the immediate quarter. But there are domains: aviation, nuclear energy, deep infrastructure, healthcare, and increasingly artificial intelligence, where moving fast and breaking things is not an innovation strategy. It is a formula for catastrophe. In these high-stakes arenas, the primary product is never just the physical machine, the lines of code, or the service rendered. The physical asset is merely a delivery vessel. The true underlying product is certainty. The profound lesson of Boeing's fall and its ongoing painful resurrection is that trust is not a marketing overlay. It is not a public relations campaign rapidly deployed after a crisis to calm investors. It is not a mission statement painted on the wall of a corporate lobby. Trust is the deep, load-bearing infrastructure of your enterprise. It is the absolute, uncompromising alignment between what you publicly promise, how you actually operate behind closed doors, and the specific behaviors your culture rewards when nobody is watching. It is the hardest asset to build, taking decades of flawless execution to establish. It is the easiest asset to destroy, requiring only a few quarters of compromised standards. And ultimately, it is the only asset that actually matters when the survival of the enterprise is on the line. When you compromise the invisible system to serve the visible metric, you are not just borrowing against the future, you are setting the entire house on fire. If you found this analysis valuable, subscribe to the channel. We dissect the hidden systems, quiet failures, and strategic doctrines behind the world's most powerful companies every week. Until next time.